The house was still. Emma had returned to her childhood home for the first time in years. The old farmhouse sat on the edge of a forest, its sagging roof and peeling paint standing as a testament to the passage of time. Her father had passed a month ago, leaving her as the sole inheritor of the property. Emma didn't have the heart to sell it outright, not yet, anyway. The house was full of memories, laughter in the kitchen, her mother singing as she baked, her father's deep voice telling stories by the fire. But not all the memories were happy. Emma's hand brushed against the banister as she climbed the stairs, recalling the times she'd bolted up them in fear, her eyes glued to the massive grandfather clock in the living room. That clock. It had been her father's prized possession, passed down from his grandfather. Made of dark mahogany with intricate carvings of twisting vines and snarling beasts, the clock stood nearly 8 feet tall, its presence dominating the room. It ticked loudly, a relentless rhythm that seemed to echo through the entire house. Emma had always hated it. It wasn't just the sound. It was the way the clock seemed alive. As a child, she swore she'd seen the carvings move out of the corner of her eye. She'd hear faint whispers near it when no one was around. Her father dismissed it as childish imagination. But Emma always gave the clock a wide berth. Now, as she stepped into the living room, the clock greeted her with its familiar chime. She froze. Her father's lawyer had assured her the house had been untouched since his death, yet the clock was running. She walked over, her eyes narrowing as she examined it. The pendulum swung methodically, and the hands ticked toward 8 p.m. Strange, Emma muttered. She reached for the clock face to stop the pendulum, but as her fingers brushed the cool glass, a sudden jolt of static made her yank her hand back. The room seemed colder now, the air heavier. Shrugging it off, Emma decided to focus on her task. She needed to sort through her father's belongings, decide what to keep, and prepare the house for sale. But as the hours passed, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Shadows in the corners seemed to stretch longer than they should. The floorboards creaked in empty rooms. And always, the clock ticked. At midnight, the first incident happened. Emma had been upstairs, sorting through a box of old photographs. She was staring at a picture of her father as a young man when the chime echoed through the house. 12 resonant strikes. She frowned, the sound seemed louder, sharper than before. Almost deliberate. As the last chime faded, a low creak sounded from downstairs. It wasn't the usual groan of an old house settling. It was the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Emma's blood ran cold. She grabbed a flashlight from her bag and crept down the stairs, her heart pounding. The living room was empty, but the air felt charged, as if a storm were about to break. Her eyes darted to the clock. The pendulum had stopped, but the hands pointed firmly to 12 o'clock. She stepped closer. The carvings on the clock's surface seemed different. The vines were twisting more aggressively, the beast snarling in what looked like agony. Emma's throat tightened. She rubbed her eyes, convinced it was a trick of the light. When she looked again, they were as they always had been. Ornate, but still. Just your imagination, she whispered, retreating upstairs. The second incident came the following night. Emma had decided to sleep in her childhood bedroom. The clock's chimes had been silent since midnight the night before, but she couldn't shake the unease it had planted in her mind. As she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the air grew colder. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. And then, she heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping. It sounded like nails against wood, coming from below her. Emma's chest tightened as she sat up, straining to hear. The tapping stopped. Silence stretched on for what felt like hours. Then came the whisper. Emma. Her name, soft and drawn out, as if spoken by a voice that hadn't been used in years. Emma's breath hitched. She scrambled out of bed and grabbed her flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness as she edged toward the stairs. The living room was empty. The clock, however, had changed again. The hands now pointed to 3 a.m., even though her phone read 2:45. The pendulum was swinging again, but slower than it should. And the carvings were unmistakably moving now. The vines writhed like snakes, and the beasts turned their heads to stare at her. "Stop it," she shouted, her voice breaking. The room fell silent. Then the clock struck 3. 1 chime. 2. 3. On the final strike, the glass of the clock face shattered outward, sending shards flying across the room. Emma screamed and stumbled back. From within the clock, something shifted. A shadowed figure, barely distinguishable, loomed behind the broken glass. "You shouldn't have come back," it rasped. Emma bolted. She grabbed her car keys and ran, not stopping until she was safely inside her vehicle. The farmhouse loomed in her rearview mirror as she sped down the dirt road, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She didn't return to the house. Instead, she called a realtor the next morning and put it up for sale. She left the key under the mat and didn't look back. Weeks later, the realtor called her. "We've had a few interested buyers," he said. "But they're all asking about a clock." Emma's stomach twisted. "What about it?" "They say they can hear it ticking," he replied. "But when they look, there's nothing there." Don't forget to like and subscribe for more horror stories.